Hello and good evening, everybody. I'm back, and I want to thank you for tuning in and joining us for our next lesson in the book of Deuteronomy. I've got my Bible here in front of me, and I hope that you do too, and I've got a cup of water here as well, in case I start having another coughing fit. This evening, we are going to look at the rest of Moses' second speech to the Israelites in the book of Deuteronomy. And this is going to be a pretty long, pretty big set of chapters that we're going to cover. We're going to go from chapter 29 to chapter 26. So, or 29 to 26. 19 to 26. Excuse me. So, we're going to be going pretty fast. And what I've done here is I've taken a selection of what I would think the more interesting ones of these chapters are, and we're going to talk about those and talk about the underlying principles for those, because remember, when you look at the laws in the law of Moses, you're not supposed to just look at the words themselves, you're also supposed to look at the underlying principles of these laws set into the context of the ancient Near East culture that is ancient Israel, or was, and discern the value set that God is communicating in these laws, right? So let's get onto it, and I want to say up front, all of these laws in these chapters are pretty intriguing just in their own ways, but we just don't have enough time to look at all of them. So that's why we're going to go so fast. That's why we're going to look at just a couple of them for each chapter. And without further ado, let's get to it. Starting off in chapter 19, we have a very important set of laws for ancient Israel, and that is the cities of refuge. You'll find this from verses 1 through 13. The nation, the Promised Land, was divided into three by these cities of refuge. There were three on the west side of the Jordan, that is in the Promised Land, and there were three on the east side of the Jordan in the lands of, what were they? Of Reuben, Gad, and half of the tribe of Manasseh. So there were a city of refuge in each of those territories as well on the east side of the Jordan. What these cities were for was that if someone accidentally killed someone else, they could flee to one of these cities of refuge and they would be safe. The reason why they would need to flee is, of course, if a person was murdered, their next of kin was dubbed their avenger, and they could go out and seek justice on the murderer if that person has not already been put to death by due process of the law. So the Avenger, not any Marvel IP, but the Avenger, the next of kin of this killed person, would go and seek justice on the one who killed their relative. But what happens if it was a total accident? In our modern parlance, we call that manslaughter, which I really think sounds worse than murder, but it's not actually worse than murder. It's accidentally killing someone. So the illustration that Deuteronomy gives us is if someone goes out with their fellow Israelite into the forest and they're chopping down some trees, and their hand slips when they swing the axe, and the axe just flies off, hits a man in the head, and he dies. That is completely by accident. But what if there wasn't anyone to witness it? What if there wasn't anyone who can say, that was a complete accident? Their next of kin, the next of kin of the man who died, is going to come and seek justice on the one who killed their brother or father or cousin or whatever. So the one who accidentally killed the man can flee to the city of refuge, whichever one is closest, and then the avenger arrives there, and the idea is that is a neutral place where they can sit down, discuss this, hash it out, and if it really was an accident, then, I don't know, maybe there's a fine that they need to pay. The exact details of it are kind of up to the elders of the city. But if it is actually the case that it was murder, if it wasn't accidental, if it was actually intentional and the person just ran to the city of refuge hoping to trick everyone, then they would be handed over to the avenger. There was a thorough investigation that was done by the elders and the judges of the city. So it wasn't a way for people to get away with murder. It was a way for people to not be unjustly killed because they accidentally killed someone. They committed manslaughter instead of murder. If it was actually murder, they are not protected. If it is found that they came into the city under the false pretense of having accidentally killed someone, and it's found that they intentionally killed the person, they are just thrown out of the city, and the avenger has them. You're already cornered. And so, an underlying principle for this is very important to the character of God, the nature of God, and that is He cares deeply about justice, and He understands that it is almost human nature not to administer justice perfectly, because we let our emotions get the better of us a lot of the times. And sometimes even when we think we're doing what is good, it turns out to be a mistake. The avenger thinks that he's doing the right thing, going to kill the person who killed his brother, cousin, uncle, father, whatever. But in fact, it was an accident, so killing that person would be wrong. Seeking that revenge would be wrong. And that would not be justice. God puts this in place so that either way, justice is had. If it was an accident, justice is had in that the person who accidentally killed the man is not put to death. But if it turns out that it was actually murder, justice is still had, because through the thorough investigation, the truth is arrived at, and the murderer is handed over, and they face justice anyway. Pretty cool. Pretty important. Justice is pretty important to God. Another thing that we find in chapter 19, and this is literally one verse, and I'll read it here, verse 14. You shall not move your neighbor's landmark, which the men of old have set, in the inheritance that you will hold in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to possess. So this is also mentioned in the book of Proverbs. You must not move the ancient landmarks. Why is it so important that they not move these landmarks? Because the landmarks mark out the property lines of the Israelites, and that is not just an arbitrarily man-made property line. That is an inheritance given to these people by God. And it is a part of their, let me form my words. It is their part of the promise that was made to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob. So it's not just an arbitrarily, man-made property line. It is God-made property line, and it is their part of the inheritance of Israel, that is the promised land. And so to move the property line, to move the landmarks that mark the property, is to steal a part of the promise that God made to their forefathers, to steal it and take it for yourself. And that is inappropriate on so many levels. Because one, you do not have the authority that God has. You don't have the authority to move that, to transfer that inheritance. But also, do you think yourself so important that you deserve more of the inheritance than your neighbor, or that you deserve what God gave to them? No, you're not so important as to do that. If one paid no mind to the fact that this is part of the promise that God made to Israel's forefathers, then one would say, oh, it's not so important. I mean, it is theft, but it's not that bad. But when one understands that this is the matter of God's promise to this people, I mean, if you put it in in a Christian perspective, put it in the context of a Christian, we have a promised inheritance in the new creation, in heaven. What if someone stole that from us? We didn't do anything to lose it. What if someone just stole it? How would you feel? Exactly. So they could not move the landmarks, their neighbors' landmarks. They could not steal their property because that's more than just property. Okay? That is a part of the promise that they had with God. Chapter 20 is a very interesting one. It's laws concerning warfare. Now, nowadays, we have laws that dictate what we are allowed to do and not allowed to do in the context of war. But back then, such was not the case. Essentially, you could do anything that your brain thought up if you were creative enough in order to win. But here, God gives them rules. And essentially, the main thrust of the idea was that Israel is only to go to war for the purpose of possessing the inheritance, the promised land. So when they went to war before they have completely possessed the promised land, it is for the purpose of taking what is God-given to them. After they have come to possess the promised land, the only reason they're supposed to go to war is to defend their promised inheritance. So the thing that we need to understand, and there are lots of critics that criticize the Bible over the fact that God told them to go and fight all these people and push them out or kill them off. What we need to understand is that, as per chapter 9 in Deuteronomy, God already said, I'm not giving you this land because you're so great. I'm not giving you this land because you're better than the other people in any way. I'm giving you this land, one, because I promised Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that I would give you a land to live in. But number two, I'm giving you this land because I'm using you, Israel, as a tool to administer justice to the people who have lived in this land because they are so wicked. So when we witness Israel pushing out the people who lived in the Canaan Valley region before them, we need to understand that it is God administering his justice through Israel. And that's going to make a lot more sense of some of the things that we witness here in this command. So firstly, the Lord wanted to make sure that they understand he does not like bloodshed for the sake of bloodshed. Israel is not going to war with these people for the sake of going to war with them. It is justice. So he regulates it. The regulations that Israel had to follow are threefold. Number one, they are always supposed to offer peace first. Now, the terms of this are supposed to be non-negotiable. If they accept peace, then they are supposed to serve Israel. They become Israel's slaves. Now, that sounds a little harsh, but remember, Israel has the command that every 7 years, the slaves get released. So it's not forever. And once that happens, the people can decide whether they want to leave or stay and continue serving the Israelites. So it's completely up to their volition after 7 years. But number two, they were not supposed to allow their culture, the Canaanite culture, to be revived in their midst. Now, if the people left, they do their culture somewhere else. But they don't do it within Israel. Now, specifically, this was to stamp out the pagan religions so that Israel would not become tempted to go away from God and defile themselves with idolatry. And the way that this commandment tells them to do that is they are to put every male to the sword. The women and the little ones and the oxen and the cattle, whatever, that is to be taken as the spoils of war, but the males are all to be put to the sword. Why? Because the males represent the military ability of that people, but they also represent the religious leadership of each household of that people. So if you don't want the idolatry to have a resurgence, then you make sure that everyone who is the religious backbone of that culture is not there anymore. And then you make sure that the women and the little ones, the ones who are not the religious backbone in an ancient Middle Eastern culture, become Israelites. You know, they are inducted into the Israelite culture. So the women, of course, they serve Israel for those 7 years. Then they decide if they want to stay or if they want to go. If they want to stay, they become part of the Israelite culture instead of whatever culture they were before. The children, if they have a mother, go with the mother whichever way she decides. But if they're orphans, then after those 7 years, they make the decision for themselves. And if they go, then they go. But if they stay, they become a part of the Israelite culture as well. So that is the second tenet, that is the regulation Israel was supposed to follow in regards to warfare. The third was to essentially keep the damage to a minimum. These houses, these vineyards, these farms that they are conquering and taking, they're supposed to live on them afterwards. And so it would defeat the purpose of this whole conquest to destroy those things. But also, if they lay siege to a city, God specifically says, don't cut down the fruit trees. Eat off of them instead. You know, if you have these other trees that don't produce fruit, cut them down, use them to make your siege engines or whatever. But if they grow fruit, don't cut them down. They're important. They are supposed to be useful after the conquest. So it's very interesting that in a context where usually people would be allowed to do whatever they want, that is in the context of warfare in the ancient world, God makes Israel obey some specific regulations. And they're not allowed to just do whatever they want. They're not allowed to just slaughter people after they have surrendered. They're not allowed to just go and straight away attack people with no prior communication. They're supposed to offer peace first. They're not supposed to, like how the Romans did to Carthage. They salted the earth so that it could never grow anything again. They're not supposed to just wantonly destroy everything. And they were not supposed to allow these people to have a cultural resurgence and thus continue with idolatry in the midst of the Israelites. They were supposed to get rid of that because that's what this was all about, delivering that justice. Then in chapter 21, we have laws about marrying female captives. You know, when they go and they conquer a city and they bring the women and the children back, a man might look at one and say, oh, she's beautiful, I'm in love, I want to marry her. So we've mentioned this before in our studies on Exodus and Numbers. If you were there to hear the lessons on Exodus, those aren't on YouTube, and I apologize for that. That happened before we got online. But we mentioned it before in our class on Numbers, but it bears repeating here. If a man wants a captured woman, that is, from one of these Canaanite nations, to be his wife, he must first take her home, naturally, but also he must let her mourn for a whole month. He's not allowed to marry her yet. He's not allowed to go into her. He's to keep hands off, let her mourn for a whole month for her deceased family members. And also, she is supposed to de-beautify herself. She cuts her hair. She, I forget the exact things that she's supposed to do. She cuts her hair. She clips her nails, shaves her head. She takes off the clothes that she was wearing when she was captured, and she puts on, clothes of mourning, and she mourns for her family. And so she de-beautifies herself. She makes herself no longer attractive. And then after that month, the question is, oh man who wanted to marry this woman, do you still love her? Do you still delight in her? If you do, well then by all means become her husband. We know that you're going to love her truly, because after this time when she is no longer pretty, she's no longer pretty, you still are affectionate towards her. But if not, though, what is the man supposed to do? You let her go. You let her go free, and she goes. Maybe she stays in the nation of Israel, becomes an Israelite. Maybe she leaves. Maybe she leaves and goes and finds a life for herself somewhere else. But you let her go. You don't sell her as a slave. You don't require any price for her freedom. You let her go, because she was going to be your wife. You don't own her. You don't own her at that point. She doesn't belong to you. You let her go. And I find that very interesting. God made a regulation, again, in a context where men would just be allowed usually to do whatever they want. He puts some regulations in place to make sure that no one is mistreated. And especially to make sure that the more vulnerable people in the situation, the women, are not mistreated. God doesn't want anybody to get hurt. Then we have from verses 22 through 23, this matter of a man who is hanged on a tree. You'll remember that this is brought up in connection to the Christ by Paul in Galatians chapter 3, and we're going to read that in a little bit. But first, let's read this passage. Verse 22 and 23. If a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So if the man remains on the tree all night, the land is defiled, and that is very bad, because the land is not just any land, it's the inheritance from God. And the man who hangs on the tree is cursed. Like I said, Galatians chapter 3, verses 10 through 14. For all who rely on works of the law are under a curse. For it is written, Cursed be everyone who does not abide by all things written in the book of the law, and do them. Now it is evident that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. But the law is not of faith. Rather, the one who does them shall live by them. Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree, so that in Christ Jesus the blessing of Abraham might come to the Gentiles, so that we might receive the promised Spirit through faith. So it seems like one cursing from God is as equal to another cursing from God, no matter what the context may be. So Christ became cursed because he hanged on the tree. He became cursed for us so that we are not subject to the curse of the law, that if we do not follow the law, we are condemned. If we do not follow everything in the law of Moses. And instead, there is grace, and we do not follow the law of Moses anymore. Instead, we have the law written on our hearts and in our minds, all Hebrews chapter 8. The new covenant is here instead of the old. So, like I said, that's brought up in relation to Christ. Christ became cursed for us so that we might not be subject to the curse. Then we arrive in chapter 22, and we have laws concerning sexual immorality. This is from verses 13 through verse 30. And it begins not with talking about what constitutes sexual immorality, and not with talking about how to like the divorce procedure, but it starts with forbidding false accusations. I find that very interesting, that God is so concerned with justice that the first thing he talks about when he talks about sexual immorality in this passage is forbidding false accusations. He says, if any man takes a wife and he goes into her and then he hates her, he doesn't love her anymore, and he accuses her of misconduct, that is, sexual misconduct, and brings a bad name upon her, saying, I took this woman, and when I came near her, I did not find in her evidence of virginity. Then the father of the young woman and her mother shall take and bring out the evidence of her virginity to the elders of the city in the gate. What exactly is the evidence? I don't really know. But anyway, and the father of the young woman shall say to the elders, I gave my daughter to this man to marry, and he hates her, and behold, he has accused her of misconduct, saying, I did not find in your daughter evidence of virginity, and yet this is the evidence of my daughter's virginity. And they shall spread the cloak before the elders of the city. Then the elders of the city shall take the man and whip him, and then he will pay a fine of 100 shekels of silver to the father of the young woman, because he has brought a bad name upon a young woman of Israel. And she will be his wife, and he cannot divorce her all the days of his life. But if the thing is true, that evidence of virginity was not found in the young woman, then they shall bring out the young woman to the door of her father's house, and the men of the city shall stone her to death with stones, because she has done an outrageous thing in Israel by whoring in her father's house. So you shall purge the evil from your midst. So here we have this thing that is supposed to guarantee justice, that if it is found that this man is simply accusing his wife of sexual immorality, but it's not true, it's a false accusation, that man gets whipped, he gets hurt, and he has to pay a fine. And number 3, I find this the most entertaining part of all, he cannot ever divorce this woman. She is married to him for the rest of their life. That is called justice. That's in some circles we call that poetic justice, because it's specifically geared towards exactly what the wrongdoing was. It's poetic justice. That is real justice. He cannot divorce her for the rest of his life. Now, don't get me wrong, this does not give her a free pass to commit adultery because he can't divorce her, because there's still the death penalty for adultery if it's found out. So, as long as she remains faithful, he can't ever try this again. He can't ever divorce her again. And if ever he does try, it's going to be looked on with real suspicion, because he tried this in the past. They're not going to listen to him. I find that incredibly entertaining. I find that incredibly ironic. But like I said, actual adultery was still punishable with death for both the man and the woman who engages in it. Now, here's another interesting thing. If a If a man is found lying with the wife of another man, both of them shall die, the man who lay with the woman and the woman as well. So you shall purge the evil from Israel. Verse 23. If there is a betrothed young woman, and a man meets her in the city and lies with her, then you shall bring them both out of the gate of the city, and you shall stone them to death with stones, the young woman too, because she did not cry out for help, though she was in the city. You know, there's a lot of people in the city. And the man, because he violated his neighbor's wife, so you shall purge the evil from your midst. But if in the open country a man meets a young woman who is betrothed, and the man seizes her and lies with her, then only the man who lay with her shall die. But you shall do nothing to the young woman. She has committed no offense punishable by death, for this case is like that of a man attacking and murdering his neighbor, because he met her in the open country, and though the betrothed young woman cried for help, there was no one around to rescue her. So this is a really interesting topic. It's actually one that I will assume is very emotionally charged for a lot of people. If a man sexually assaulted an Israelite in a city, she is expected to cry out for help, and it is so expected that everyone around her is to help her, to help rescue her because she is their neighbor. Love your neighbor as yourself. Then if she does not cry out, it is tantamount, apparently in the law of Moses, to her taking part in the adultery. That is, I don't think that should be viewed as something that is unfair, as something that is God, being prejudiced against women. I think that should actually speak more to what God expected from all of the Israelites, that they will take personal responsibility to help when they hear a cry for help, especially in this situation. So much so that if you don't cry for help, you were told to cry for help, and people will help you if they are around. But, of course, if you do cry for help, but you're in the open country, you're not in the city, you're not where a bunch of people are, and no one comes, then you're not at fault because no one was around. You cried for help, no one was around to help. So, it's, like I said, that's going to be emotionally charged for a lot of people, but I brought it up because it speaks in a very interesting way about what God expected from his people, that they are not going to stand by as something wrong is happening. They're going to jump in and save the person. That is what he expected every one of them to do. Lastly, this is from verses 28 through 29. If a man meets a virgin who is not betrothed, it's just a young woman, and seizes her and lies with her, and they are found, then the man who lay with her shall give to the father of the young woman 50 shekels of silver, and she shall be his wife. And, because he violated her, he is not allowed to divorce her for the rest of his days. Again, how's that for justice? How's that for irony? You assault this young woman, you lay with her, she's not married to anyone else, and so you have to make an honest woman out of her. But first, you pay for it. You have to pay her father 50 shekels of silver, which is not a paltry sum. And you have to always be, you cannot divorce her for the rest of your life. How about that? Next, in chapter 23, we get, from verses 15 through 18, we get laws, not 15 through 18, 15 through 16, we get a law concerning runaway slaves. And if you are an American, this is probably one you should pay attention to, because a lot of people try to justify the historical American system of slavery using the Bible, and I want to show you this, okay? Verse 15 of chapter 23. If you don't believe me, open your Bible and read it for yourself. Okay? You shall not give up to his master a slave who has escaped from his master and come to you. He will dwell with you in the midst, or in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. So, if a slave flees from his master, you shall not give him up to his master. First, consider the restrictions that God put on slavery in Israel. We've explored it elsewhere. It cannot be a kidnapped person, or else you are liable for being put to death if you buy a kidnapped person. Only one who owes a debt can enter into slavery. 2. It's always going to be a fellow Israelite who is the master. Israelites were not supposed to be given over into slavery to Gentiles, and if they were indebted to a Gentile, their fellow Israelites had a responsibility to pay off their debts and redeem them from slavery. So, no Israelite was supposed to be slave to a Gentile, and so it was expected that this situation is an Israelite slave and an Israelite master who are both held accountable to the law of Moses. And number 3, the master cannot harm the slave, because if he does, he risks having harm done to himself, the harm that is equal unto the harm he did to his slave. You weren't allowed to beat your slaves in ancient Israel. And so, if a slave actually runs away, something has to be really wrong. This person is not simply someone running away from slavery. This person is a victim of some way that the master has mistreated them. And so, don't give them back up. Don't give them over to their master. That would be wrong, because that would be handing a victim back over to their abuser. And that's not what you're supposed to do. So that was in chapter 23. Now in chapter 24, we have the matter of divorce. When a man, verse 1, takes a wife, he marries her. If then she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, and she departs out of his house. And if she goes and becomes another man's wife, the latter man hates her and writes a certificate of divorce for her too, and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house as well. Or if the latter man simply dies, who took her to be his wife, then, verse 4, the former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife, after she has been defiled, meaning she has had relations with the other man, for that is an abomination before the Lord, and you shall not bring sin upon the land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance. So here we have divorce was only allowed if, quote, she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some indecency in her. Now, there is the classic debate in Jewish theology of, Rabbi Shammai and Rabbi Hillel. Shammai said this is implying sexual immorality is the indecency that the husband would find. That is their only reason for divorce. Rabbi Hillel said, well, it doesn't actually say that. It says any sort of indecency, and he says it could be simply that she burned his food, and so he can divorce her. That's the classic debate. Jesus put an end to that debate, at least for Christians who believe unto him, that it is sexual immorality that is the only grounds for divorce. If you divorce your wife, or you divorce your husband, if you are the wife, for any other grounds than sexual immorality, it is a sin. It's adultery. You're not supposed to do that. And if someone marries the woman after that, then they commit adultery too. And if you marry a divorced woman, of course, implying that it is wrongly divorced woman, you are forcing her to commit adultery, sexual immorality as well. So the indecency in this passage is specifically some form of sexual misconduct, some form of sexual immorality. So the man divorces the wife because of that. She goes and marries another man, and he divorces her. It is then not lawful for the first man to remarry her. This is the idea. If you have divorced her, you've sent her on her way, and then, now that she's married another man, and she's out of that relationship again, maybe he died, maybe he divorced her too, and all of a sudden you say, I really miss her. That ship has sailed. That plane has flown, my friend. You should have stayed married to her if you really loved her that much. Or at the very least, you should have come to her before she found another man and say, I am so sorry. I truly do love you. Will you remarry me? Because that is something that the man could do. Before she married another man, you could remarry. Because it is up to the party that has been wronged whether or not they forgive the person and remain married or remarry. But if they've married another person already, then they're not she's not your wife anymore, man. You don't just remarry her. She has been with another man. And therefore it is not lawful for you to remarry her. You will be defiling the land on which you live. It is apparently, quote, an abomination before the Lord. You don't commit abominations before the Lord. Bad things happen. Then in chapter 25, we get some laws concerning, this is from verse 5 to verse 10. We get laws concerning levirate marriages. Levirate meaning that, how to describe it? If a man marries a woman, but he dies before giving the woman a child, because, it takes a couple of tries, right? Or maybe you can't even. If he dies before giving the woman a child, his household needs to be perpetuated. It needs to be, I believe that's what the word levirate means. It means to perpetuate. And so the man's brother needs to take the woman as his wife and have a child with her. That child is not considered his son, but it is considered the son of his late brother, and therefore that child, that son, will inherit the possessions of his late father. Then all the children after that are considered the children of the brother, and so life goes on. Every house in Israel had to be perpetuated. And so it was the brothers, it was the next of kin's duty to perpetuate it. If the brother died without producing an heir. Now, what happens if the brother refuses to do this? The actual thing that is supposed to happen is he is publicly shamed. And in a culture like the ancient Near East, being publicly shamed is a really big deal. Specifically, it says, if the man does not wish, verse 7, to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders and say, my husband's brother is refusing to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel. He will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of his city shall call him and speak to him, and if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders, and pull the sandal off his foot, and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house, and the name of his house shall be called in Israel the house of him who had his sandal pulled off. Now again, this is in the context of the ancient Near East, so we have to take that into consideration instead of just gawking at how weird this sounds. But the woman is supposed to come to the brother who refuses to do his brotherly duties and take the sandal off his foot, spit in his face, and declare that he has been shirking his duties. So shall it be done to every man who does not build up his brother's house. Now, this is mentioned, it's not fully mentioned, but this specific practice is brought up in the book of Ruth. Ruth chapter 4, Ruth is the widow of a man named Mahlon, whose name I believe means going to die, which if you name your child anything, don't name him Mahlon. But Boaz goes to the next of kin because Boaz wants to marry Ruth. He is the next of kin, but he goes to the next of kin to respect the law, and he says, hey, your relative's widow is here, and it is your duty to marry her and produce an heir for that dead relative. And the man says, I don't want to do it. You can marry her instead. Because Boaz says, if you don't want to marry her, I'll marry her instead. So he says, you can marry her instead. Now, if they were going to follow the law of Moses here to the letter, Ruth was supposed to come up and take that man's sandal, spit in his face, and pronounce, so shall it be done to every man who does not build up his father or his brother's house. But by this time in Ruth chapter 4, this has been sort of muddled down to a business practice. It's a business transaction. It says in those days when one wanted to make a business transaction, he simply pulled his sandal off his foot and gave it to the person as a signifier that he was doing business. that is not what this command is actually supposed to be. This command is actually meant to publicly shame the person who has shirked their duties to their brother. But it was turned into something else. When you read the book of Ruth, we look at the book of Ruth, and we look at all the parts of how it's a romantic story, and it's all this, and it's all that. There are some very interesting details that signify that the people in the book of Ruth are, aside from Boaz, they're not blameless, they're not very great. Boaz was the only really upstanding gentleman in that context because he wanted to marry Ruth, he really did. But he said, the law requires that I at least go through this avenue first. Your next of kin who is your redeemer. So, the book of Ruth is a very interesting one, and a lot of people don't understand how interesting it actually is and the way it is interesting in, because, you got people who are looking at each other, they're going, whoa, that's one hot lady. And you got people who are getting each other drunk and making it seem like they slept together in order to make the guy marry her. You know exactly what I'm talking about if you read the book of Ruth. And you have this part where a actual command of God has been muddled down into a sort of way of signifying a business transaction. Are you kidding me? Okay, on to the last chapter. Chapter 26 of the book of Deuteronomy. This is going to be the end of Moses' second speech to the Israelites here. And it has to do with first fruits and tithes. Like I said, we got to go by fast, so we're just going to summarize. The main thrust of this is that Israel could not presume to hoard all their wealth that they gain from the land, because they are not the ones who actually produced it. God was. God is the one who actually produced all this wealth. So, they had to bring the first of their harvests to Him. Keeps them grateful, reminds them of the generosity of God. But also, they had to bring a tithe of all their produce. Tithe means 1/10. So, a tithe of all their produce for the Levites and the poor to benefit off of. The Levites don't have farmland, so they can't produce for themselves. They rely on the tithes, and the poor, of course, need the tithe as well because they are poor. They are down on their luck. They are out of the ability to produce for themselves. So they need that tithe too. Essentially, recognizing God's generosity produces generosity in the Israelites, because God produces all of this for them, so they are generous with it, and they don't hoard it. I think that's a very important thing for Christians to understand, because God has been extremely generous to us, and He has been extremely generous in His judgment of us. We call that grace. When generosity meets judgment, it's called grace. God has been extremely generous and extremely kind to us, because while we were yet sinners, Christ still died for us. Therefore, we need to be generous to others, both with our physical means and also our judgment of others, because we were not any better. God still loved us. Thank you for joining me this evening. I hope that it has been enlightening. I hope that we have all gotten something very useful out of this class. And I hope to see you next week when we begin Moses' final speech to Israel in the book of Deuteronomy, and really his final speech to Israel for the rest of his life, because he's going to die at the end of Deuteronomy. So I hope to see you there. Till then, stay safe, stay healthy. God bless you all. Have a good night.